Silicon Bites, episode 68. And in this one, we look at the fall of Bashar al-Assad and his regime in Syria, but put it in the context of Putin's regime. It seems like the walls are closing in on Vladimir Putin. Assad is falling. In fact, the total capitulation of his regime may be confirmed by the time this episode comes out. The mainstream media are paying attention and giving these details prominence that is fitting with their historical importance. The rapid collapse of the Assad clan's 50-year reign of tyranny is a major blow to Russia and Iran in the region and will send out shockwaves to autocratic regimes around the world. Color revolutions are back. It's doubtful Putin will see these as organic manifestations of people power or reactions to a brutal repression of a dictator. For him, autocracy is the natural order of the world, so he is likely to see plots and conspiracies by his enemies behind the unfolding events. The walls are closing in on Putin as, one by one, his schemes to project Russian power, control, and influence around the world fail. Hezbollah and Hamas are decimated and their power much reduced. The Islamic Republic of Iran is greatly weakened and humiliated. The attempt at state capture in Romania through one of the Kremlin's puppet populist politicians has failed decisively. The reaction of the Romanian security services and electoral commission provides a template for how sovereign democracies should fight back hard against Kremlin influence and operations. The decades-long attempt at state capture in Georgia is faltering, fast descending into brutal repression and violence. The mask of Kremlin intentions has been ripped off. The hybrid approach is no longer effective, and they are resorting to brutish violence in their desperation. Lenin's quote comes to mind: "There are decades when nothing happens, and then weeks when decades happen." Whether the forming regime in Syria is more tolerant and humane than the previous one is not something we can be certain of. But the bar was set so very, very low by Assad, the head of a regime that slaughtered, gassed, and tortured its own citizens on an industrial scale. What we can be sure of is that the fall of the regime is an utter humiliation for Putin. Russia pumped billions into Assad and the regime, and all of that seems now to be lost. Russia has lost its only naval base in the Mediterranean, or at least is on course to lose it. This was an essential springboard for regional and even global influence, as well as the ability to project military power. Putin wanted to restore the apparent glory of the Russian Empire, but has instead put his country onto a fast track back to 1991 and the economic turmoil of the post-Soviet period. In the end, the brutal Bashar Assad dictatorship fell in just 11 days. To external observers, it was sudden and unexpected, though given what seems to be detailed planning, coordination, and training on the part of the disparate rebel forces, perhaps the victory is not a surprise to them or to one of the key sponsors of this insurrection, Erdogan's Turkey. Assad ruled for 24 years from the year 2000. The symbolism cannot be lost on Putin, who also ascended to the presidency of Russia in the year 2000. Putin cannot be feeling comfortable about his own fate. Haunted by visions of Ceausescu and Gaddafi, he is likely to become even more paranoid. Assad is now suspected of fleeing to Russia as a plane from Syria disappears off the radar around midnight. As he fled the lightning advance of rebel forces, US officials believe he's headed for refuge in Moscow. Imagine how crowded the Kremlin is becoming, stuffed with deposed tyrants and murderers, as well as failed proxies and puppets. There's every indication that Russia won't try to delay the inevitable fall of Assad, and in fact, they are likely powerless to influence events on the ground. Assad has left Syria, claims Russia's foreign ministry. Rumors have also been swirling that Assad's plane was shot down, but this is just speculation until hard evidence is made available. According to the same ministry, Bashar al-Assad, who ruled Syria for nearly 25 years, left the country after giving orders for a peaceful handover of power. Moscow claims also not to have taken part in talks leading up to his departure. But remember, this is a Russian government statement, so part of it or all of it could be a fabrication. However, what's clearer is that Russia's military bases in Syria have been put on a high state of alert. Moscow was in touch with all the Syrian opposition groups and urged all sides to refrain from violence, Reuters reported, which of course is remarkably ironic given the scale of death and violence that Russia has inflicted together with Assad on the Syrian civilians for the last 14 years. The Syrian Foreign Ministry proclaims that a new page is being written in the country's history, a remarkable about-face for regime journalists, propagandists, and apparatchiks that were sworn enemies of the rebels just a few hours before. No doubt, to save their necks, these people will claim that they were just following orders, or did not know what was really going on, or are just lowly cogs in a bigger machine. They will gladly throw their former masters and colleagues under the bus to save their own skins, their own incomes, their own privileges. This really makes you imagine whether Solovyov, Simonyan, and Skabieva will perform such a 360-degree twist and disavowal of Putin when he falls. It's likely, but the thousands of hours of genocidal tripe they have uttered over the last decade and more is all preserved on the internet. It won't be so easy for them to disavow their hate crimes and significant roles they have played in the criminality of the expansion of the Russian world. Assad suppressed a popular uprising in 2011 when Syrians took to the streets of major cities as part of the wave of so-called Arab Spring discontent and demanded the regime's overthrow. It began as a peaceful demonstration but turned into a civil war when Assad's regime brutally crushed the demonstrations. The civil strife is estimated to have killed more than 300,000 people in over a decade of fighting. Assad turned the full power of the state he controlled against its own people to maintain control of his dynastic autocracy. The use of indiscriminate airstrikes against civilians and chemical weapons by the regime is well documented. So this toppling of the regime may be sudden, but the impetus for it has been building for 14 years. In addition, Turkey has been supporting Syrian opposition forces with the aim of removing Iranian and Russian influence from the region. But the situation is extremely messy. It would take us many hours to talk about the different factions, the different groups, the different motivations and beliefs of them. Turkey's intervention is also against the Syrian Kurdish YPG militia, which it regards as a terrorist group. Erdogan claims the YPG has close ties with militants in Turkey, the PKK, a Turkish Kurdish group, have fought a 40-year insurgency against Turkish rule. Assad had indicated previously a refusal to speak with Turkey while Turkish forces remained in Syria. This seems to have backfired spectacularly as Erdogan is believed to have given a green light to the militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS in November to mount its remarkably successful attacks on Aleppo and more recently on the city of Homs. It seems now to record this, they are entering the suburbs of Damascus. But there, as ever, with this use of proxies, there is no guarantee Turkey can control HTS or order the Islamic group to end an offensive that has proved far more effective than any of them ever likely expected. President-elect Donald Trump has also announced on Truth Social that Bashar al-Assad has fled his country after losing the backing of Russia, and that United States should have nothing to do with events in Syria, and further that the US should avoid engaging militarily in Syria. This sentiment was echoed by none other than Jake Sullivan too, so there's a certain alignment there across the US political spectrum. Now, before we dive into more details, the rapid downfall of Assad underscores several things. The regimes that have withstood tremendous pressure and assault for decades, sustained by terror and oppression, can crumble extremely quickly and in quite unpredictable ways. What seemed to be forever is over in the blink of an eye. Was the fall of Assad the failure of will or resources, or both? A tyrannical regime may retain the willingness to inflict violence and coercion on its population, and if they maintain the means to continue that, they may be able to physically and psychologically coerce the opposition into a defensive or even an underground role. But when resources falter, the fear dissipates. It can happen rapidly, like waking suddenly from a nightmare. When the minions of such a regime suddenly fear that their privileges and incomes are at risk and the regime no longer has their back, things crumble remarkably quickly. There is a lesson in here for observers of Russian despotism and, of course, a lesson for the despot Putin. It's the brittleness of such regimes we need to watch. Even if we cannot predict the day nor the hour of their collapse, it seems that all dictators go in the same way in the end. To an extent, Putin's war in Ukraine played a crucial role in the fall of Assad, as Putin has propped up the Assad regime for 2 decades, giving it the material and political strength to project its power over the region. Assad would have been gone long ago if it were not for Russian military resources, advisors, and support. Autocracy requires a lot more resource to maintain its authority through the state architecture of fear than democracies do. They burn resources and burn money to maintain their control. But when that runs thin, they collapse suddenly. Russia withdrew a substantial amount of military presence for its war in Ukraine that was essential to perpetuate Assad's regime. Here we see the very real manifestation of overreach by the Kremlin. It is simply spreading its resources far too thinly over too many fronts. And another lesson from this that the Western powers need to learn is that Russia expands when it encounters a vacuum of power or a vacuum of resistance to its malign presence. Where there is no organized opposition, or it can use divide and conquer tactics on the opposition, the Kremlin triumphs. And Russia's allies remain in charge, but present Russia with an adversary that has will, leadership, and resources, and typically the Russian state or its proxy forces, such as the Wagner Group, will fold like a pack of cards, because brutality is no substitute for strategy. Let's ask the question, who is Mohammed al-Jolani, the rebel leader who has toppled Assad's rule in Syria? We know little to date, but more details are coming to light. Jolani's real name is Ahmed al-Shara, and he has a controversial past. His group is rooted in Syria's branch of al-Qaeda and has been accused of extremist activities. Recently, he adopted a more moderate image while leading the fight to oust Assad. He has stated the primary goal is to overthrow Assad, and he has called upon his supporters and the disparate groups that make up the rebel armies not to target civilians and minorities. That includes reassuring residents of newly liberated areas, including Aleppo, which is home to a significant Christian minority. Speaking to residents, he promised no harm would come to them under his administration. He also urged his fighters to maintain security in captured areas. Once known for operating from the shadows, Jolani has now taken a public role. During the offensive, he appeared in Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, after it was captured by rebels for the first time in the war. He has stopped wearing the traditional turban often linked to jihadists and opted for military fatigues and a khaki shirt, presenting himself as more practical and adaptable. During a visit to Aleppo's citadel, Jolani was seen waving to the crowds, a stark contrast to his former reclusive persona. He also began signing statements under his real name, a shift interpreted by some as an attempt to distance himself from his militant past. Born in 1982 to a well-off family in Damascus's Mazar district, Jolani's path to jihadism reportedly began after the 9/11 attacks. He apparently was inspired by the attackers and began attending secret sermons in Damascus. He later joined Al-Qaeda in Iraq and was detained for 5 years before returning to Syria in 2011 to found the Al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda's Syrian branch. Those ties were broken in 2016, a move he claimed was meant to prevent Western retaliation. Despite this, HTS is classified as a terrorist organization by many Western governments, and the UN has classified some of HTS's actions as war crimes. So is he a kind of pragmatist or an opportunist? Are we seeing a process of Syria shifting towards becoming a fundamentalist Islamic republic? There are signs he has moderated his rhetoric while at the same time consolidating the power of HTS in Idlib province by merging with rival Islamist groups. The group established a civilian government in the region, but is also accused of brutal crackdowns on dissent. Finally, I want to point you towards an interesting academic voice and analyst of the unfolding conflict, that is Phillips P. O'Brien. He puts the impact on Russia and its global ambitions in context. Having access to military facilities in Syria is crucial to Russia, being more than a regional power. The naval base at Tartus and the airfield at Latakia are arguably the most important Russian military facilities outside of Russia itself. What Russia is on the point of potentially losing are key facilities which allow it to project power into the Mediterranean and throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Tartus is the only reliable warm water port Russia has in the Mediterranean, and military facilities in Syria have become a staging point to supply Russian operations throughout Africa. Without them, Russian strategic possibilities are much more limited, argues Phillips P. O'Brien. This access, gained through support of Assad, was seen as vital by Putin. Russian presence in Syria is part of the wider image it has sought to create as a global power. The loss of Syria will seriously dent Russia's self-image too, as it's relying upon its so-called prowess in supporting Assad and the military skills honed there to puff up the Z patriot community. Phillips P. O'Brien suggests looking at the plethora of Valde Club publications that regularly boast of how awesome Russia's performance was in Syria and what a great military power Russia is. For those not familiar with it, the Valde Club is Putin's incredibly well-funded in-house think tank, which pushes his narratives and which a remarkable number of Western analysts have been involved with in the past. Just a note of caution: if you are ever not sure of the statements made by an analyst or expert, just check if they have ever been a collaborator in this venture, the Valde Club, and treat them with caution. If they have maintained this affiliation after 2014 or published more recently to the Valde Club website, then I would go further and view them outright as an asset or agent of Kremlin influence. Phillips P. O'Brien's conclusions are similar to what has been stated earlier in this episode. Authoritarian regimes collapse in an incredibly short period after seemingly decades of stability. In Syria's case, less than 2 weeks. Once they start to crumble, it becomes increasingly difficult to prop them up or return to any status quo. Assad survived for so long because Russia was able to call up greater resources to prop up Assad than either his regime or the opposition possessed. Who will invest in Putin's regime to prop it up when the cracks widen in the wake of an accelerating economic crisis and crumbling foreign policy? China is unlikely to tip the trillions of rubles it will require to keep Putin in power into Russia's economy and into its government. And if it does so, it will not want to see those resources being tipped back out into the black hole of a disastrous war in Ukraine. Putin may try to pretend that the fall of Assad is not a big deal, but he is fooling no one, not least the Z patriots and bloggers in Russia who are losing their minds over the collapse of Russian global power and its military failures. This is a major strategic humiliation that could turn into a strategic problem if Russia loses access to its bases in Syria. Russian strength is weakening almost everywhere in the distant and near abroad. Dominoes are falling, and the walls may well feel to Putin like they really are rapidly closing in on him, his regime, and his minions.